She spent her life serving in silence, never asking for anything. When she finally got the chance to rest, she was met with coldness. Gradually, her presence became a burden, and care turned into neglect. But a single act of courage began to change everything. If this story caught your interest, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and let us know what city you're watching from. And now, our story continues. Helen never imagined she would one day live in an apartment overlooking the ocean in Miami Beach, Florida. Her entire life had been spent in other people's houses, serving families who barely knew her full name. Helen Miller, born and raised in a working-class neighborhood in the Bronx, learned from a young age that her place was in the back, in the kitchen, in the windowless maid's rooms. She learned to walk with her head down, to speak softly, to take up as little space as possible. Her mother, also a housekeeper, always said that people like them couldn't make waves, couldn't complain. They had to be grateful for their daily bread and the hand-me-down clothes they received as gifts. At 22, Helen married Michael, a simple man, who worked as a construction worker. He was a good, hard-working man, but life didn't give them much time to build a future together. 3 years after their wedding, Michael had a heart attack on a job site and didn't make it. He left Helen 6 months pregnant, with nothing but a few dollars saved in a cookie tin. The boy was born strong and healthy, and she decided she would do everything to give him a different life. She named him Paul, in honor of the man whose house she last worked in, a man who had always treated her with respect. Paul grew up watching his mother leave before dawn and come home late at night, exhausted, her hands raw from scrubbing pots and floors. She washed other people's uniforms during the day and sewed at night to pay for his tuition at a modest private school. She never let him go without. The food was simple, but there was always enough. His clothes were clean, always ironed, new notebooks at the start of every school year. Helen made her entire life a continuous act of silent sacrifice. She didn't complain, didn't cry in front of her son. She kept it all inside, as if the pain were a burden only she was meant to carry. Paul was always a dedicated boy. He studied with determination, wanting to escape that life of hardship. He got into a good state university for business administration and years later landed a job at a major consulting firm. He climbed the ladder quickly. He had talent, ambition, and a hunger to succeed that came from watching his mother bend over backward her whole life. By 35, Paul was already a manager, living alone in a small but comfortable apartment in Brooklyn Heights, and was starting to move in circles Helen only knew from a distance, when she cleaned the dining rooms of her employers. It was in one of these circles that he met Jessica. She worked in the finance department of another company, but attended the same corporate events. Jessica was beautiful, elegant, with a confident way of speaking, and a presence that commanded any room. She came from an upper-middle-class family from the Upper West Side, went to private school, and studied abroad in Europe. She was everything Paul thought success looked like. They started dating, and less than a year later were married in a discreet but sophisticated ceremony at a restaurant overlooking the Central Park Reservoir. Helen went to the wedding wearing an outfit her neighbor had sewn for her. She sat at a table in the back, quiet, smiling at people who walked past without looking at her. Paul was radiant but distant. Jessica was polite, formal. But Helen felt something strange in her gaze. A coldness disguised as friendliness, a silent judgment on everything she represented. But she said nothing. She never did. After all, her son was happy, and that's what mattered. The first few years of the marriage passed without much contact. Paul would visit his mother every now and then, always in a rush. He'd bring some money, ask if she was okay, and leave. Helen kept working, though it was getting harder. Her legs ached and her hands trembled when she held heavy objects. But she didn't complain. She was afraid of being a burden, afraid of getting in the way of the son who had fought so hard to succeed. It was Mrs. Davis, her employer of many years, who noticed first. Helen fainted in the kitchen while making lunch. When she woke up, she was in the hospital. The doctors talked about high blood pressure, anemia, and extreme exhaustion. They recommended rest, better nutrition, and medical follow-up. Mrs. Davis called Paul, worried. She said Helen couldn't work like that anymore, that she needed to be cared for. Paul was flawed. He had never stopped to think about his mother's health. She had always seemed indestructible, always there, always ready. He talked to Jessica, and she, with that firm, practical tone he admired, said the solution was simple. They had just bought a larger apartment on the Upper East Side, 3 bedrooms, with a view of the city skyline. One of the rooms could be for his mother. That way she would be close, well cared for, and Paul could monitor her health. Helen resisted at first. She didn't want to be a bother, didn't want to disrupt her son's marriage. But Paul insisted so much, so convinced it was the right thing to do, that she finally gave in. She packed her few belongings into 2 old suitcases and moved into the apartment on the Upper East Side, a place that looked like it was straight out of a magazine with marble. Floors, designer furniture, abstract paintings on the walls, and a breathtaking view of the city. For the first few days, Helen walked around the apartment as if she were a guest. She was afraid to touch things, afraid of breaking something, afraid of making a mess. Jessica showed her to her room, a nice but cold space. Everything was very white, very clean, very impersonal. There were no photos, no warmth, just a bed, a closet, and a window that faced the service hallway. Helen thanked her quietly and put her things away in silence. A routine began to form. Paul left early for work and came home late. Jessica also worked but had more flexible hours. She came and went at different times, always busy, always on the phone, always wrapped up in commitments. Maria, the housekeeper who had been with them for 4 years, became Helen's most constant companion. Maria was a woman in her early 40s from a small town in West Virginia. She had 3 children she was raising on her own and sent money home every month. She worked Monday through Saturday from 8 in the morning to 5 in the evening and knew every detail of that house. She also knew every nuance of Jessica's behavior. She knew when she was pleased and when she was annoyed, though her annoyance never came with yelling or slammed doors. It came with long silences, sharp glances, and a coldness that could freeze the room. In the beginning, Jessica was cordial to Helen, but always with a calculated distance. She would ask if everything was okay, if she needed anything, but never really waited for an answer. It was as if Helen's presence was a necessary but inconvenient arrangement. She reorganized the household routine with military precision. Helen was to have breakfast in her room, so as not to interfere with the morning rush. Lunch would be served in the kitchen, as the dining room was used for other things. And dinner, well, Paul was almost never home for dinner, so it didn't matter. Maria noticed the subtle changes. Before, she ate in the kitchen by herself, but now she shared the space with Mrs. Miller. She also noticed that the portions Jessica told her to serve her mother-in-law were small, disproportionate. A piece of fruit, a slice of bread, a cup of unsweetened tea. When Maria tried to serve more, Jessica intervened with an icy smile and said that Mrs. Miller was on a diet, that the doctor had recommended portion control because of her high blood pressure. But Maria knew a lie disguised as concern when she saw one. She had worked in many homes, seen many family dynamics, and this wasn't care. It was control. It was a subtle way of making someone disappear without anyone noticing. She kept quiet, but she started watching more closely. Helen, for her part, accepted everything without question. She was used to eating little to being grateful for whatever was offered. She thought that maybe it really was better to eat less, that maybe she was weighing on the household routine. She started leaving her room less and less. She would spend hours looking out the narrow window that faced the hallway, watching Maria come and go with laundry, listening to the muffled sound of the TV in the living room. When Paul came home at night, Jessica transformed. She became attentive, helpful. She would ask how Mrs. Miller's day had been, if she had eaten well, if she was comfortable. Paul, exhausted from work, believed her completely. He thought his mother was being well cared for, that Jessica was making an admirable effort. After all, it wasn't easy having your mother-in-law living in the same house. He would thank his wife, praise her patience, and Jessica would smile, satisfied. But at night, when Paul was asleep, Jessica wasn't smiling. She would look toward Helen's room with a mix of disdain and impatience, as if the presence of that woman were a stain on her perfectly organized life. Are you enjoying this story? Tell me your opinion on it and how you think it will end. The weeks dragged on, and Helen began to feel weaker and weaker. She would wake up tired, even after a full night's sleep. Her legs trembled when she tried to stand, and a constant dizziness followed her throughout the day. She tried to talk to Paul a few times, but he was always so busy, so immersed in spreadsheets and meetings, that she didn't want to be another problem on his list. So she kept it all to herself, as she always had. Jessica noticed Helen's growing frailty, but instead of showing concern, she just tightened the routine even more. The meals became even smaller. The morning tea was now served lukewarm, with nothing to go with it. Lunch was a thin, watery soup. Dinner, when there was any, was a mashed piece of fruit and a glass of water. Jessica claimed it was better for the digestion of someone her age, that heavy food was bad for her, that it was important to keep her stomach light. Maria watched it all with a heavy heart. She saw Mrs. Miller losing weight before her very eyes, her skin growing paler, her eyes losing their spark. One morning, while tidying up the kitchen, Maria decided to take a risk. She made some buttered toast, a warm latte, and a generous slice of cornbread she had baked the day before. She put it all on a tray and took it to Helen's room. Mrs. Miller looked at the food with tears in her eyes. It had been so long since she'd seen a real breakfast, since she'd smelled fresh bread. Maria sat on the edge of the bed and said softly that she needed to eat, that she was too thin, that this wasn't right. Helen held Maria's hand and thanked her, her voice choked with emotion. She began to eat slowly, savoring each bite as if it were the most precious food on earth. But Jessica had eyes and ears in every corner of that house. She walked into the room without knocking, with that controlled smile that never reached her eyes. She looked at the tray, then at Maria, and said in a soft but cutting voice that she shouldn't be doing this, that Mrs. Miller had dietary restrictions, that the doctor had been very clear about her diet, and that Maria, while well-intentioned, was putting her mother-in-law's health at risk. Maria felt her blood run cold. She knew there was no doctor, knew there was no diet, but she also knew that Jessica had the power to fire her with a snap of her fingers, and she couldn't lose this job. She had bills to pay, children to support, a whole life that depended on that salary. She lowered her head, apologized, and left the room with the half-eaten tray. Helen was left alone, staring at the closed door. A deep sadness washed over her. It wasn't anger, not rebellion. It was a gentle, resigned sadness, the kind felt by someone who no longer expects anything from life. She lay back down and closed her eyes, feeling her stomach rumble with hunger. The days crawled by with a cruel monotony. Helen spent hours in her room, sometimes sitting on the edge of the bed, sometimes lying down, staring at the ceiling. She heard the sounds of the house, Jessica's phone conversations, the noise of the TV in the living room, Maria's footsteps in the hallways. But she herself was like a ghost, present but invisible, existing but not part of anything. Paul continued to leave early and come home late. When he arrived, he would go straight to his mother's room, give her a quick kiss on the forehead and ask how she was. Helen always said she was fine, that she didn't need anything. Paul would look around, see the clean room, the made bed, the closed window, and convince himself that his mother was comfortable. Jessica would always be waiting for him in the living room with a reassuring smile, saying that Mrs. Miller had eaten well, had rested a lot, that everything was under control. One night, Paul had to travel to Chicago for work. He would be gone for 3 days. Jessica drove him to the airport, kissed him affectionately, and said she would take care of everything. As soon as she got back home, something in the air shifted. It was as if a mask had finally dropped. That first night without Paul, Jessica didn't even ask if Helen needed anything. She had dinner alone in the dining room, watched television, talked on the phone with friends, and went to bed. Helen stayed in her room, hungry, thirsty, but without the courage to leave. She was afraid of being a bother, afraid of causing a scene, afraid of being an even bigger burden. The next morning, Maria arrived earlier than usual. She had a bad feeling, an unease that had kept her up all night. She went straight to Mrs. Miller's room and found her lying down, pale, breathing with difficulty. Maria felt panic rise in her throat. She ran to the kitchen, made some sweetened tea, and brought it with some crackers. Helen managed to eat a little, but she was very weak. Maria helped her sit up, fluffed her pillows, and opened the window to let in some fresh air. Jessica appeared at the doorway with that cold, calculating look. She said Maria was overreacting, that Mrs. Miller was just a little tired, that it was normal for her age. But Maria, for the first time, found her courage and said she thought they should call a doctor. Jessica laughed, a dry, humorless laugh, and said there was no need, that she knew her mother-in-law better than anyone. But Maria didn't back down this time. She said Mrs. Miller was losing too much weight, that she wasn't eating right, that she needed help. Jessica's tone changed. Her voice became hard, authoritarian. She said Maria was crossing a line, that she was a housekeeper, not a doctor, and that if she kept meddling where she wasn't wanted, she would lose her job. Maria's legs trembled, but she didn't give up. She looked Jessica straight in the eye and said that maybe it would be better to call Paul to let him know his mother wasn't well. Jessica took a step forward, her face tense with restrained anger. But before she could say anything, Helen, in a weak but firm voice, asked them to stop. She said she didn't want any trouble, that everything was fine, that it was just exhaustion. Maria left the room heartbroken. She knew Mrs. Miller was protecting everyone but herself. She knew she was afraid of causing problems, afraid of being kicked out, afraid of losing her son, and that fear was slowly killing her. That afternoon, Jessica left for an appointment and gave express orders that Maria was not to serve Helen anything but water. She said she was fasting for some tests they would do when Paul got back. Maria pretended to agree, but as soon as Jessica left, she rushed to the room with a plate of rice, beans, and chicken. Helen ate with tears in her eyes, whispering thanks between each bite. Maria held her hands and said that this couldn't go on, that she deserved to be treated with dignity, that she needed to fight back. But Helen just shook her head. She said her whole life had been like this, that she'd always had to shrink herself, that she didn't know how to be any different. She said she was afraid of losing her son's love, afraid of being a burden, afraid of dying alone and abandoned. Maria felt a deep pain hearing those words. She recognized her own story in them, the story of so many women who spent their lives serving, erasing themselves, disappearing so that others could shine. But she also felt she had to do something, that she couldn't just stand by and watch Mrs. Miller waste away. When Jessica returned that evening, Maria had already left. She went into Helen's room and saw the empty tray on the nightstand. Her face contorted with rage. She grabbed the tray forcefully and stormed out, slamming the door. Helen shrank back in her bed, knowing there would be consequences. The next morning, Jessica called Maria into the living room and said in an icy voice that she was fired, that she didn't follow orders, that she meddled where she shouldn't, that she was causing problems. Maria felt the floor drop out from under her. She tried to argue, begged for a second chance, but Jessica was adamant. She said she would pay her for the month and that she could leave immediately. Maria, her eyes filled with tears, went to Helen's room to say goodbye. She found the old woman sitting on the edge of the bed, staring into space. She held her hands and said she was so sorry, that she wished she could have done more. Helen thanked her for everything, for her kindness, her courage, her care. She said Maria was an angel God had sent her way, even if only for a short time. Before she left, Maria did something she had never done before. She took a piece of paper and a pen, wrote down Paul's cell phone number that was on a list on the fridge, and gave it to Helen. She whispered that if anything happened, if she felt very sick, she should call her son, that she shouldn't be afraid to ask for help. Helen tucked the paper under her pillow and waved a silent goodbye. Jessica hired a new housekeeper the next day, a younger, quieter woman who didn't ask questions and followed orders without a word. The routine returned to what Jessica considered normal, and Helen continued to lose weight, to grow weaker, to disappear inside that luxury apartment with a view of the city. Paul returned from Chicago with his head full of numbers and strategies. The trip had been productive. He had closed a major deal and his career was on the rise. He got home late at night, tired but pleased. Jessica greeted him with a kiss and a special dinner. She said everything had been quiet while he was away, that his mother was fine, resting in her room. The next morning, before leaving for work, Paul went to his mother's room. He knocked softly on the door and went in. What he saw stopped him in his tracks. Helen was lying in bed, her face so pale it seemed transparent, her eyes sunken, her hands trembling on the sheets. She looked as if she had aged 10 years in just 3 days. Paul felt a tightness in his chest. He sat on the edge of the bed and took his mother's hand. It was ice cold. He asked if she was okay, if she was feeling sick. Helen forced a weak smile and said she was just a little tired, that she would feel better soon. But Paul couldn't ignore that empty look, that extreme fragility. He promised he would call from work to check on her, and left the room with a strange feeling in the pit of his stomach. During the day, Paul couldn't concentrate. The image of his mother, so frail, so faded, wouldn't leave his mind. He called home at lunchtime. Jessica answered in her calm, controlled voice, saying that his mother had eaten some soup, that she was resting, that he didn't need to worry. But Paul remained uneasy. In the late afternoon, he decided to leave work early. He got home around 6, an unusual time for him. Jessica was surprised but hid it well. Paul went straight to his mother's room. He found her sitting in the armchair by the window, staring outside with a distant expression. He noticed she was even thinner, that her clothes hung loosely on her frame. He sat down next to her, and for the first time in a long time, he truly looked at his mother, not in a hurry, not with his mind elsewhere, but really looked. And what he saw terrified him. This was not the same woman who had come to live with him a few months ago. This was a faded, consumed, defeated version of her. He asked when she had last left the room, when she had been out in the sun, when she had talked to anyone. Helen couldn't answer. The days had all blurred into one, an endless sequence of empty hours. Paul felt guilt squeeze his chest. He had brought his mother here to care for her, but in reality he had abandoned her in a beautiful but lonely room. That night at dinner, Paul asked Jessica about his mother's routine. He wanted to know what she ate, how she spent her days, if she had any visitors. Jessica answered with rehearsed patience, saying that his mother preferred to stay in her room, that she was too shy to interact, that she ate very little because she had no appetite. It was all said with such conviction that Paul almost believed her. But something inside him was beginning to stir, a small but insistent voice telling him that something was wrong. He decided that the next day he would take his mother to the doctor, run some tests and find out what was going on. The next morning, Paul told his office he would be in late. He went into his mother's room, determined to take her to the hospital. But when he tried to help her stand, Helen nearly collapsed. Her legs wouldn't support her, her whole body was shaking. Paul felt panic take over. He called for Jessica, asked for help, but she maintained her usual icy calm, saying it was just weakness, that it would pass. But Paul wouldn't accept it. He picked up the phone and called for an ambulance. Jessica tried to talk him out of it, saying he was overreacting, that he was wasting money. But Paul wasn't listening anymore. He held his mother in his arms, felt how light she was, almost weightless, and a dull anger began to build inside him. The ambulance arrived in 15 minutes. The paramedics examined Helen quickly and said she needed to be taken to the hospital immediately. She was dehydrated, malnourished, and her vital signs were alarming. Paul rode with his mother in the ambulance, holding her hand the entire way. Jessica was left behind, standing in the doorway of the apartment, with an expression that was a mixture of anger and concern. At the hospital, the doctors ran a battery of tests. Helen was admitted to receive IV fluids and proper nutrition. Paul stayed by her side the whole time, watching as she received the care she should have been getting at home. One of the doctors pulled him aside for a private conversation. The doctor was a middle-aged man with a serious but kind gaze. He said that Mrs. Miller was suffering from severe malnutrition, that her body was shutting down from a lack of basic nutrients. He asked about her diet at home, her routine, who was taking care of her. Paul tried to answer but realized he knew nothing. He didn't know what his mother ate, didn't know how she spent her days, knew absolutely nothing. The doctor was direct. He said that this level of malnutrition doesn't happen overnight. It was the result of weeks, maybe months of inadequate nutrition. He asked if someone was responsible for her care at home. Paul felt the ground give way beneath him. Jessica. It was Jessica who was at home, who organized the meals, who said everything was fine. He spent the night at the hospital, sitting beside his mother as she slept, connected to wires and machines. His mind was in a turmoil. He started to remember small details he had ignored. The former housekeeper, Maria, who had been fired so suddenly. The times his mother seemed to want to say something but fell silent. Jessica's glances, always so controlled, so cold when she thought no one was watching. The next morning, Paul called Jessica and said they needed to talk. She arrived at the hospital impeccably dressed, her expression one of perfectly composed concern. She sat next to Paul in the waiting room and asked how his mother was. Paul stared at her for a long moment before speaking. He said the doctors had diagnosed her with severe malnutrition, that his mother was starving to death inside their home. Jessica tried to defend herself, saying that his mother wouldn't eat, that she refused food, that she was difficult to handle. But Paul didn't believe her. He knew his mother, she would never refuse food. She had gone hungry her whole life to make sure he ate. Jessica changed tactics. She said she had done the best she could, that it was hard to care for an elderly person, that Paul was never home to see what it was like. But Paul saw it now. He saw it with painful clarity. He saw that he had trusted the wrong person, that he had abandoned his mother in the hands of someone who saw her as an inconvenience. The argument escalated. Paul asked about Maria, why she had been fired. Jessica said she didn't follow orders, that she was a troublemaker. Paul felt his anger explode. Maria had been fired because she cared, because she had tried to help, because she had seen what he had refused to see. Jessica, for the first time, lost her composure. She said she was sick of being the villain, that she had accepted his mother into their home when she didn't want to, that she had given up her privacy, her comfort. She said that his mother was a burden, an unwelcome presence that didn't fit into their lives. The words came out like venom, finally revealing what had always been there, hidden beneath polite smiles and false concern. Paul fell silent, looking at the woman he had married and seeing a stranger. He said in a low but firm voice that Jessica could leave, that he would take care of his mother himself, that he didn't need her anymore. Jessica laughed, a bitter laugh, and said he was being dramatic, that he would get over it. But Paul didn't back down. He said that when his mother was discharged, he would take her somewhere else far away from there, and that Jessica would have to choose whether she wanted to stay in the marriage or not. Jessica stood up, her face red with rage, and said he would regret this, that he was throwing away everything they had built for an old woman. Paul looked her in the eye and said, "That old woman is the only person who has ever loved me unconditionally in my entire life." Jessica stormed out, slamming the door. Paul went back to the room where his mother was resting. He sat beside her, took her hand, and for the first time in a long time he cried. He cried out of guilt, anger, and shame. He cried for having failed the one person who had never failed him. Helen slowly opened her eyes and saw her son weeping. With the little strength she had, she squeezed his hand. Paul looked at her and begged for forgiveness. He apologized for not seeing, for not protecting her, for letting her suffer. Helen, with tears streaming down her face, said he didn't need to ask for forgiveness, that she understood, that she loved him. Paul swore in that moment that everything would change, that he would never again let his mother be treated as if she were invisible, a burden, someone disposable. That from now on, she would be his priority, not a convenient arrangement. Helen was hospitalized for a week. Every day Paul arrived at the hospital early and only left late at night. He took time off from work, postponed meetings, delegated responsibilities. For the first time in years, his priority wasn't his career, but his mother. He was there for every meal, every dose of medication, every doctor's visit. He wanted to be sure she was being well cared for, that she was recovering. During those days, Paul had a lot of time to think. He thought about how he had gotten lost in the pursuit of success, how he had drifted away from his own roots. He remembered his childhood, the simple dinners at the small table in their Bronx apartment, his mother coming home tired but always with a smile for him. He remembered how he had promised himself that one day he would give her a better life, but he had forgotten that a better life wasn't just a luxury apartment with a city view. It was care, attention, and presence. Jessica did not return to the hospital. She sent a few cold text messages asking when his mother would be discharged, but Paul replied with the same coldness. The distance between them grew with each passing day. and Paul realized that perhaps they had never been as close as he had imagined. Jessica loved the image of success he represented, the life they could have together. But true love, the kind that endures imperfections and sacrifices, she never had to offer. On the 5th day of her hospital stay, Paul received an unexpected call. It was Maria. She had called the apartment trying to speak with Mrs. Miller, and the new housekeeper had told her about the hospitalization. Maria was frantic, wanting to know if Mrs. Miller was okay. Paul asked her to come to the hospital. When Maria arrived, she entered the room with her eyes already welling up. Seeing Mrs. Miller connected to machines, so frail and pale, broke her heart. She sat by the bed, held her hand, and cried. Helen cried too, and between tears, she thanked Maria for trying to help, for being the only one who saw what was happening. Paul had a long talk with Maria. She told him everything. She told him about the minimal meals, about how Jessica controlled every aspect of Mrs. Miller's life, about how she had been fired for trying to help. She told him about Mrs. Miller's fear of being a burden, of being abandoned. Paul listened to every word with a heavy heart, the guilt growing with each revelation. He apologized to Maria for not seeing, for not believing her when she tried to help. He offered to pay her for the month she had been out of work, but Maria refused. She said she hadn't done it for money, but because she saw her own mother, her own story, in Mrs. Miller. She said that women like them, who spent their lives serving, deserved to be cared for with dignity. Paul promised Maria that things were going to change, and he said he would like to hire her again, not as Jessica's housekeeper, but as his mother's caregiver. Someone who would be there out of affection, respect, and genuine care. Maria accepted with tears in her eyes. On the 7th day, Helen was discharged. The doctors said she had responded well to treatment, but would need constant monitoring, proper nutrition, and a lot of love. Paul already had a plan. He wasn't going back to the apartment on the Upper East Side. He had rented a small, cozy house in Greenwich Village, a charming and quiet neighborhood, with tree-lined streets and a sense of community. The house was simple, but filled with light. It had a small balcony, where you could sit and watch the sunset, a little garden with flowers, airy rooms, and a large kitchen. It was the opposite of the cold luxury apartment where Helen had withered away. It was a place that felt welcoming, not exclusive. Paul helped his mother settle into the master bedroom, the best room in the house. He put up old photos on the walls and brought in objects that were meaningful to her. He wanted that space to be truly hers, not just a room she was allowed to use. Maria organized the kitchen and prepared a special lunch with fluffy rice, seasoned beans, roasted chicken, and a fresh salad. The smell of home cooking filled the house, and for the first time in months, Helen felt a sense of belonging. During lunch, the three of them sat together at the table. Paul served his mother with care, making sure she ate slowly, without rushing. Helen savored every bite, tasting not just the food, but the flavor of being cared for with love. Maria told funny stories about her kids, and for the first time in a long time, they heard Helen laugh. A quiet, shy, but genuine laugh. The days that followed were about rebuilding. Paul reorganized his life. He requested a transfer to a position that required less travel, fewer overtime hours. He prioritized being home, having dinner with his mother, listening to her stories, and taking her to doctor's appointments. He discovered that the woman who had spent her life caring for him had so much to say, so many memories, so much wisdom stored away in silence. Jessica, for her part, did not take the separation well. She tried to convince Paul to come back, saying it had all been a misunderstanding, that they could start over. But Paul was firm. He said there was no way to restart something that never had a true foundation. He began the divorce proceedings and, with them, the painful task of rebuilding his life. Maria became an essential part of the household. She was no longer just an employee, she was family. She cooked with love, talked for hours with Mrs. Miller, and brought her children to visit on weekends. The house in Greenwich Village filled with life, with laughter, with movement. It was everything the apartment on the Upper East Side had never been. Slowly, Helen gained weight, recovered her strength, and started to smile again. The walk started short, just to the front gate. Then they went to the small park at the end of the street. Then to the farmer's market on Saturdays, where she would pick out fruit and chat with the vendors. Every step was a victory, a reclaiming of herself. One afternoon, Paul took his mother to the beach. They sat on the sand, looking at the ocean. Helen said quietly that she had never imagined she could be happy again, that she thought her days would be nothing but pain and loneliness until the end. Paul held her hand and said that she deserved to be happy, that she deserved to be seen, that she deserved to take up space in the world. Helen looked at her son with tears in her eyes and said that he had given her not just a new home, but a new life, a life where she didn't have to apologize for existing, where her voice mattered, where her exhaustion was respected and her hunger was satisfied. Paul replied that she was the one who had given him a new life by teaching him what truly mattered. The months passed, and the transformation was complete. Helen was no longer the faded, invisible woman from the luxury apartment. She was a woman who laughed loudly, who cooked alongside Maria, who gave her son advice, who tended to the flowers in the garden. She had taken her place in the world again, not as a shadow, but as someone who mattered. Paul learned lessons that no university or corporation could ever teach. He learned that success without presence is empty, that true love isn't shown with expensive apartments, but with time, attention, and care. That family isn't who shares the same roof, but who truly shares a life. Jessica moved on, finding someone who better fit her world of appearances. Paul held no grudge. He understood that everyone has their own battles, their own wounds, but he also understood that he wasn't responsible for carrying others' burdens when it meant abandoning the one who truly needed him. One evening, sitting on the balcony under a starry sky, Helen told her son that she felt at peace, that even with everything she had been through, the suffering had served to show her what was really important. Paul agreed. He said that sometimes life has to break us so we can rebuild ourselves in a more genuine way. And there, in that simple house in Greenwich Village, surrounded by genuine affection, Helen and Paul found what many spend their entire lives searching for. They found belonging. They found peace. They found the certainty that, in the end, what sustains a life isn't luxury or status, but the assurance that we are seen, heard, and loved exactly as we are. End of story. Dear listeners, we hope the story of Helen and Paul has touched your heart. If you were moved by this narrative about new beginnings, about the importance of seeing those right beside us, and about the power of true love, please leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments what part of the story resonated with you the most. Every day we bring you intense stories like this one, stories that reveal the deepest side of the human soul and make us reflect on our own lives and relationships. We'll see you in the next episode.